Now, turning our attention to lethal management, there are some advantages and disadvantages to lethal management, just like there were for non lethal management. One of the large advantages to lethal management is that, again, these are typically more cost effective as a group of practices than non lethal management. The other huge advantage to lethal management, however, is that you are actually able to solve the problem, sometimes permanently using lethal management because you've actually eliminated the animal, but you also sometimes may be able to remove individuals from a population, and by reducing the population of animals in the area, you can reduce the magnitude of the problem. So lethal management has some very, very good advantages to it over non-lethal management. However, the downside of lethal management, again, is that not everybody is in favor of lethal management, and these practices do kill animals, so you need to be aware of that. And the other issue is that these practices are not universally applicable in all areas. And again, in areas where you've got high human densities, a lot of times there are laws that prevent you from discharging a firearm. So shooting an animal, for example, within the town limits may be illegal as well as unsafe if you've got a lot of human people around you. But with that being said, here are your options for lethal management. And again, you can shoot the animal. And so sometimes if you've got a game animal such as turkey causing problems or geese causing problems or deer causing problems, there are seasons during the year where you're legally allowed to shoot these animals. But there are also times that you can get what's called a depredation permit from the state wildlife agency to allow you to shoot these animals out of season if they're causing problems. And a lot of times the shooting permits or these depredation permits are applied more toward an agricultural setting than they are toward a urban or suburban setting. But in some instances, you can get a depredation permit to take care of an animal, lethally shooting it, even if it's a non-game animal, such as a woodpecker, for example. Body gripping traps is another option. You've got the mouse trap here in the lower left-hand corner. That's an example of a body gripping trap, as are conibear traps, which are larger traps that might lethally trap beaver or muskrat or something like that. But body gripping traps are very, very useful, and especially mouse traps and rat traps are very, very useful in residential buildings and commercial buildings and things like that. You can trap and euthanize an animal. So again, you may live trap the animal and then euthanize it. And if you were to do that, you need to pay attention to humane euthanasia techniques. And the best way to find out is to go to the American Veterinary Medical Association's webpage. And at the AVMA webpage, you can then look at the methods of euthanasia that they consider humane that are also species specific, so you can pay attention to that. And then finally, you've got a variety of toxicants out there, and toxicants are just another type of poison, or it's another word for poison. And the most common toxicant is blood thinning poison that's typically used for rodents like mice and rats and things like that. All right, some other things to pay attention to improve your success with wildlife damage management is number one, be proactive and be persistent. So, if you know that a problem is going to occur generally at the same time every year, before the problem occurs, be prepared to stop the problem, or once the problem begins to occur, be ready to stop and resolve the problem as soon as you realize the problem is beginning. The faster you can get on the problem and solve it, the quicker it's going to be solved with less frustration, less time, and less money. So proactiveness is extremely important versus being reactive. And the next thing is persistence. Sometimes you just have to be persistent in not only identifying the culprit that's causing the problem, but especially with non-lethal management options, and especially the harassment options, such as the eye scare balloon right there, which is an example of a visual harassment option, that you may just have to be persistent, and you may have to use non-lethal management options. Harassment, for example, you may have to harass that animal in random times of the day, multiple times of the day, every single day for 2 or 3 weeks, and you just may have to be persistent and outlast the animal. So proactiveness and persistence are very, very important. Another thing is that wildlife in the United States is what's called a public trust resource, which means that everybody owns the wildlife and nobody owns the wildlife. So even though an animal is on property you may own, that if that's a free-ranging species of wildlife, you do not own that animal, even though it's on your property. So that means that if you're doing things for wildlife damage management, especially in areas where there's high visibility and a lot of human beings around, you need to be very, very tolerant of other people's opinions and attitudes. And just because somebody doesn't agree with what you're doing or how you're doing it doesn't mean that you need to get into a shouting match or you need to be confrontational. So you need to be respectful of everybody's opinions and understand that not everybody may agree with how you're taking care of a problem from a wildlife damage management standpoint. And also understand, just as we've gone over the non-lethal and lethal options, there are many, many different options available to you. So if there's a less controversial option available, especially in high visibility situations, you should use that less controversial option. Finally, you want to tailor your management approach to each specific situation. This is very unlike baking chocolate chip cookies. And where you bake chocolate chip cookies, you always know you use chocolate chips and eggs and sugar and butter and things like that. And then generally, if you follow the recipe, the chocolate chip cookies taste the same each time. Well, with wildlife damage management, because you've got different tolerances of human beings and you've got different tolerances of the actual animal or the species you're dealing with, that you cannot take a cookie cutter approach for each specific situation. And an example of this is that your neighbor might say, "Hey, I've got a lot of problems with squirrels in my bird feeders. I heard that if I take sunflower seeds and replace the sunflower seed with safflower seed, that the safflower seed is more bitter tasting to squirrels and they'll stay away from the bird feeder." So sure enough, your neighbor does that, and the squirrels that your neighbor has, they don't like the safflower seed because it's bitter. So all those squirrels then come to your yard, and you say, "Hey, I'm going to do the same thing because it worked for my neighbor." So you replace your sunflower seed with safflower seed, and sure enough, the squirrels that came from your neighbor's yard, they don't like the safflower seed in your yard, so they move on to the next neighbor's yard. But the squirrels you started with, they love safflower seeds, so they don't move at all. And because of that, that's just an example of how you have to tailor your management approach to each specific situation.